I'm Dr. Daniel Burns, Associate Professor of Politics. I'm president of the Dallas Forum on Law, Politics, and Culture. The Dallas Forum was founded in 1989 as the American Public Philosophy Institute by Dr. Christopher Wolfe, who happens to be one of our respondents today. It's been a theme this year. We have had different respondents in the past, and we will have different respondents in the future. It just happens that this year we've had 3 lectures in a row where we just could not think of a better person than Dr. Wolfe. It really seemed an intellectual necessity that he'd be the respondent to these. So he's also our president emeritus. I've been very grateful personally for his ongoing contributions and continued support of our common mission. The Dallas Forum is an independent 501c3 supported in part by the University of Dallas that sponsors intellectual programming both on campus and elsewhere, whose goal is to understand contemporary American public life in the light of timeless truths about human flourishing. If you're not a UD student and are not yet on our mailing list, please go to the top of our website, dallasforum.org. It's a simple sign-up link. We don't spam. We just keep you posted about events like this one. We are a nonprofit organization with no religious affiliation, but we do hold most of our events on the campus of this Catholic school, so we sometimes do cover topics related to Catholicism, insofar as they relate also to the broader American society. So, our next and final event of the semester will be held on Monday, April 17th, the day after what would have been the 96th birthday of Pope Benedict XVI. 3 UD faculty members, Father John Beyer, Dr. Matthew Walls, and myself, will be talking about Pope Benedict's legacy, specifically with a view to what he means for the world rather than just for the Catholic Church. Today, though, we are continuing our series called UD in Dialogue, where we have an outside speaker in conversation with a UD faculty member, or in this case with 2 UD faculty members, one of whom just retired. Today's lecture is also the second in our annual series, the Nichole Tucker Memorial Lectures. We have these lectures thanks to the generosity of Shane Tucker. Shane, are you here today? Shane couldn't make it today. His wife, Nichole, died of cancer in August 2021. Nichole was a friend and supporter of the Dallas Forum, or the API. She shared our driving interest in understanding the state of American culture today, particularly insofar as faith and family play a role in shaping that culture. Some of you, I know, knew her personally. Others like me who are not that lucky have still heard from plenty of other people who did. After hearing a lot of my friends talk about Nichole, both before and after she left us, I've been especially struck by how they've emphasized her kindness, her generosity, her wisdom, her grace, and perhaps above all, her laughter and wit. We were honored last year to have Mary Eberstadt kick off the Nichole Tucker Memorial Series. We're honored again to have Yoram Hazony continue it. I think it's a fitting tribute to Nichole's memory to have such impressive speakers visit her own city of Irving. And I would like to thank Shane and Absentia for giving us the privilege of honoring Nichole this way. Now a word about our speakers, beginning with the home team, Dr. Knobel and Dr. Wolfe. Angela Knobel has been Associate Professor of Philosophy at UD for only 2 years. Before that, she spent a decade and a half teaching at the Catholic University of America, from which we seem to poach a lot of our best talent these days. Her doctorate is from the University of Notre Dame. She is one of our nation's foremost experts on the moral philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and a great scholar of scholastic moral philosophy more generally. She's recently published a book called Aquinas and the Infused Moral Virtues. Christopher Wolfe, since his retirement in 2021, has been a distinguished research scholar in our politics department. He too took a while before he found his way to Irving. In fact, even a few decades longer than Dr. Knobel. He came to UD in 2015 after some decades teaching at Marquette University. His books on constitutional law and political philosophy include The Rise of Modern Judicial Review, From Judicial Interpretation to Judge-Made Law, How to Read the Constitution, Judicial Activism, Bulwark of Freedom or Precarious Security, Essays on Faith and Liberal Democracy, and Natural Law Liberalism, as well as several edited volumes. Chris has thought as long and as deeply as anyone in this country about how a disciple of Aquinas ought to be approaching contemporary American politics and especially American law. So between the philosophy prof and the politics prof, I figured nobody would say that UD was letting Dr. Hazony off easy. Yoram Hazony himself has become one of the few most prominent political thinkers in the American conservative movement today, and not just the American, in the US and Israel, and in fact in Europe as well. He comes to us from Israel, where he was born and where he moved back as an adult after growing up and going to the school here in the US. That's also where his 9 children and 3 plus 1 on the way grandchildren now live, a sure sign of parental success. Your adult kids want to raise their kids near you. He is the author, most recently, of Conservatism, A Rediscovery, a very important work, largely of political philosophy, but also with lots of relevance to contemporary politics, and some great intellectual moral autobiography thrown in there as well at the end, as well as The Virtue of Nationalism, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, God and Politics and Esther, and The Jewish State, the Struggle for Israel's Soul. There's a lot to be said about Dr. Hazony. I'm only going to say one more thing. This lecture began as one sentence in his most recent book, where he mentions he has a lot of respect for the Catholic natural law tradition, doesn't quite agree with it in full, but doesn't have room in this book to adequately engage it and would like to do so more in the future. So I had been put in contact with Dr. Hazony. I wrote to him, said, you want to engage the Catholic natural law tradition? How about at UD? This seems like the place to do it. And he immediately said, that sounds wonderful, when can I come? And then, I'm not making this up, he read the entire Summa to prepare. I will not ask for a show of hands as to how many Catholics in this room have read the entire Summa. I will just say, this is what the university was invented for. This is the kind of dialogue that Pope Benedict was always telling us we needed more of. It's an extraordinarily rare thing in the modern academy, and I could not be more proud that we're sponsoring it here. Please welcome Yoram Hazony.
Okay, well, that's not the complete story. It's true there was a one-sentence footnote, and Dan pounced on that footnote and asked me if I would come and speak on Thomas Aquinas. And it's true that I did read the Summa, but what he left out is that I agreed to come on the condition that I not be presented as an expert on Aquinas. Okay, now, as you probably inferred from his biography, I'm Jewish, not a Catholic, I'm not a Christian. And I didn't grow up with this material. Okay, for me, I'm coming at it from the outside. The reason that I'm actually so interested is because so many of my friends, my allies in professional life are Catholics who are Thomists. At this point, you may not know, there are also a great many Protestant scholars who see themselves as Thomists, as natural lawyers. And so as a Jew moving around in Christian circles and making friends among Christians, this stuff is important. And the more time I spend with Christians, the more important it seems. So, but like I say, not an expert just in the sense that usually if I speak about something, it's something that I've been thinking about for many years. This is not really the case here. So just take it as a first crack. I'll be very, very happy to hear criticism and objections, and be very happy to revise the materials. In the end, I am going to take a firm stand, but I'm not there yet. So thank you for your openness. I just have to say, in addition to the to the usual thanks to my host, Professor Burns, he's organized 5 talks for me. It's a very, very warm welcome. It's it's not something that happens a lot, and he's gone to a tremendous amount of trouble to, after all, to do something that's kind of a risky proposition. I don't know, you brought a Jew to talk about Thomas Aquinas. Honestly, I just don't know how many people are going to think this was a good idea, especially afterwards, but we'll see what happens. All right, so with all that by way of caveats, let's get started. So let's start with the place of natural law thinking in modern political life. Okay, because there's been, at least since the Second World War, there's been a flowering of writing and books and professors devoting themselves to thinking about the Christian natural law tradition. And I think we have to see this as part of the post-World War II abandonment of, kind of a traditional Christian political framework that was based on the Bible. Before World War II, up until FDR, Eisenhower, you could still assume that political leaders, whatever else their worldview was, they thought of Western nations, and America in particular, as being biblical nations. And FDR, in his speeches about right before World War II and during World War II, he frames America as a God-fearing country a biblical country, which is free because it's God-fearing and because of its attachment to Scripture. And the enemy, the Nazi Reich and its allies, are framed as atheists. They're totalitarian because they're atheists. Now that way of looking at the world, it's mostly disappeared. And after World War II, for various reasons, the public discourse in America and other democratic nations shifted to something that I'll call Enlightenment liberalism. It's a form of Enlightenment rationalism. We can talk about it a little bit more later, but the fundamental idea is that we don't need the Bible, we don't need God, and we don't need tradition. We can speak in universal terms of reason, which can speak to everybody. And that way of thinking has permeated most corners of public life and a very large proportion of academic life and intellectual life as well. You find fewer and fewer people who think that the Bible is actually worth addressing. And part of what's happening, is that Christians who I think, now this is my interpretation, you can disagree. My impression is that as Christians become less comfortable with the Bible, they're looking for a reason alone way of arguing with this, at this point we can say revolutionary Enlightenment rationalism, which has conquered all the spaces and is driving Christianity and Judaism out of them. And so it becomes extremely important for a lot of very, very good people, including my friends, some of my teachers, to look for a reason alone way to defend the Christian or the biblical tradition without going into Scripture. So that has meant that there's a boom industry in natural law, in some natural law thinking in Thomas Aquinas, because at least some of the professors who are teaching it, like my teacher Robbie George, as a graduate student, I did 2 courses in Aquinas and natural law thinking with him. That's a long time ago. I'm waiting to find out what he thinks about this, but the drive is to find a way that we can say, look, reason brings us to Christianity or to biblical thinking. All right, so that's the background. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I don't consider myself to be, like a hostile critic of Aquinas. There's a lot of the Aristotelian framework that he builds on that I actually embrace. Let me just touch on a couple of things. First of all, the idea that things are made of form and matter. Most philosophy professors don't like this stuff anymore. I actually do. I think that it's persuasive. We can talk about it more if you like. The idea that the form is an active principle, that it provides norms, that it lets you know whether something is a good thing or a bad thing, that's an intrinsic part of reality. I believe that stuff. I think it's very good, and I dissent from the dissent against it. Similarly, the idea that human nature can be described as pursuing multiple different natural ends. I think that's true, and I think it's true that if you try to suppress the natural ends of human beings, then you probably will end up very quickly doing something that's, if not evil, then certainly wrong. I don't buy the Humean argument that you can't derive an ought from an is. If you're interested, we can go into that. But basically, I accept the general Aristotelian approach that Aquinas does. Law should be in accordance with human nature. I've already touched on that. Law and morals are aimed at shaping human societies and the individuals that live in them. And if you don't have the right view of human nature, then you're going to go way off. Right? So that makes sense to me too. Finally, another controversial point is that Aquinas insists that you can't you can't have this multiplicity of ends determining what human beings ought to do, how society should be built, if you don't have some ultimate principle, in the first instance, the common good of the society, beyond that, the will of God. If you don't have something like that in order to create some kind of order among all of the different things, then you'll end up with some kind of an idolatry of one principle or another. You have to have God to make the system work, and on that I also agree with Aquinas. So there's a whole lot that makes sense to me in Aquinas, and please bear that in mind, because now I'll look at things that I think don't work quite so well. So there's three parts to my questions, my problems with Aquinas's method. And I don't know whether we'll actually have time to quite get through all of it. This paper, if I read it straight, then I think it would take us 4 or 5 hours. So I'll just touch on the things, and where you're interested, we can go deeper. There's three parts. Part number one is, look, Aquinas is a rationalist. There are also places where he's a traditionalist, where he speaks very, very powerfully about the importance of tradition. In the modern era, these two things don't go together. One of the things that maybe the home team will help me understand is the way that Aquinas's traditionalism goes with his rationalism. Okay, if you take somebody like Descartes, who's kind of like your archetypical modern rationalist, he'll say, look, all my arguments are going to move from clear and distinct ideas, basically things that are self-evident, things that are evident in themselves, that can't really be argued if you think about them. I'm going to begin with things that you can't really argue about. Everybody has to accept them. From there, I'm going to proceed deductively. I'm going to move by infallible deductions to conclusions that are unassailable. All right, that's Descartes describing his own method. What does he think? He thinks that reason is universal. Maybe there are people who are who are not very good at it, but if you're good at it and you apply yourself and you work on it, everybody should be able to come to all of the same conclusions that Descartes comes to. He doesn't believe anybody in the world should ever come to a different conclusion from his own. That's part of what makes him entertaining. It's also what infuriates Newton so much that it creates the Newtonian science. So there's some good things about this way of thinking. I'm not claiming that kind of hubris belongs to Aquinas. But it is true that Descartes' rationalism, which then gives birth to Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Kant and their way of doing political theory, Descartes' rationalism is clearly an attempt to distill and purify and improve the rationalism that we find in Aquinas. If you ask Descartes, what do you think about tradition? Descartes says, puff, humbug, we don't need tradition, because we have clear and distinct ideas and infallible deductions using universal reason. So we don't need tradition for anything. Now that's not Aquinas. Aquinas says repeatedly that the traditions are crucial, that the law comes from tradition, that we always should honor at least the tradition of the church. So it's important to him. Nevertheless, the structure that we see Descartes trying to purify, we can see that structure in Aquinas. There is a rationalism in Aquinas, and here's the way that he describes it. He says that, hold on a second. He says as follows, we're going to begin with self-evident principles. The Latin is per se notum, which means things that when you look at them, they're evident of themselves. I don't know 100% what that means, but maybe we'll get some help on that. But he begins with things that are self-evident. He calls them certain most general precepts that are known to all. Okay, and he says that these most general principles of law and morals are, quote, imprinted on the natural reason to which they are self-evident. Moreover, quote, no man can have an erroneous judgment about them. And, quote, they can nowise be blotted out of men's hearts. Okay, so this is a very, very strong claim, that there are many things about human nature which you just have to look carefully and you'll be able to figure them out, and we'll all be able to agree. He says that with regard to these first principles, there's two categories. He's following Aristotle. There's the bodily appetites, and then there's things that are known to reason. So bodily appetites, we're talking about the fact that everybody eats, everybody needs to eat, everybody has sexual urges and wants to engage in sexual relations. The fact that we need to sleep. There's all of these things that the body provides them to us, and we don't need to get into a big, deep argument about it. We can see that almost all healthy human beings have roughly the same, or something like the same appetites in that area. In addition, there are principles that are self-evident to reason. Now, I didn't find anywhere, I may have missed it, but I didn't find anywhere a list of these first principles that are evident to reason, but I made a list of the things that I discovered when I was reading. So just to give you a sense of it, to act according to reason is a first principle of reason. To love God, to love one's neighbor, to love oneself, living in society, marriage between a man and a woman, making one's deeds good. Also, all of the ends of the moral virtues, where you're looking for the mean, all of those are self-evident to reason, I think, according to Aquinas. Doing no harm to anyone is one that he comes back to many times. Preserving justice, paying one's debts. And then one that I really, really like, which is giving fidelity, reverence, and service to the head of one's community. He thinks that this is evident to reason. Look, it's a very impressive list. I'm not sure that I came to everything, but the idea is that as you go through the Summa, you should be able to find at least one of these, which any issue that comes up, you ought to be able to make a deductive argument, an argument that flows directly and smoothly from these first principles to be able to come to conclusions. Okay, so what are my problems? Well, let's start number one. That I don't. This is kind of a cheap shot, I guess, but I don't think all of these are self-evident to reasoning people. I think today it's very difficult to reconstruct a world where love of God is a self-evident principle of reason. There are too many people arguing about it who don't seem to be able to come to it, to be able to say that no one can err concerning this. Much as it pains me, similarly, marriage between a man and a woman, I think marriage between a man and a woman is the right thing, but I don't think that it's self-evident to reason or anything remotely like that. Fidelity, reverence, and service to the head of the community, too many kids reading Ayn Rand, too many people growing up on Nietzsche, loving one's neighbor even, these things are it's very difficult to say that these are universal principles that everybody simply, through reason, you can come to them. But more troubling to me is, than that, is the fact that I feel that Aquinas is actually missing many significant parts, or at least let's say some significant parts of what to me it clearly is human nature. So let's take there's a number of examples here in the paper. I'm just going to look at one of them. Living in society, Aquinas follows Plato and Aristotle. I don't know, you may remember from the Republic that Plato says, okay, let's talk about how society is built, and his argument is that it comes out of reason, that people think about what their needs are, and they discover that it makes more rational sense, it's more reasonable to live together than to live apart. Okay, so it's an argument that claims that people maybe could have come to something else, but when you sit and think about it, there's no reason not to live in society. Now, placing living in society within the category of reason, to me, seems to be a very, very big problem. it's a problem because human beings are not the only creatures that live in society, and we don't come to live in society through reasoning. You know, I don't know if anybody here's read Jordan Peterson on lobsters. They live in society, and so do wolves, and so do horses, and so do many kinds of birds. There's all sorts of creatures, apes that live in society. Now, when I say live in society, I don't just mean that they live in proximity to one another. I mean that if you look at the studies of animals and you compare them to the kinds of things that sociologists and anthropologists write about human beings, you'll see that that there's a particular order that characterizes these kinds of societies. They're always hierarchical. This is true of human beings too. Take any bunch of 12-year-olds and give them a basketball or something, put them someplace. Within 10 minutes, they're already ordering themselves into a hierarchy. Who's more powerful? Who's the leader? The whole concept of leadership, if you're any of your political theory students, leadership is a way of describing the fact that human beings only exist in hierarchical orders. Look at academia. I mean, it's just hierarchies and competing with one another, and people competing to get to the top and bottom of the hierarchy. And none of this is through reasoning. It's all, I mean, it's hardwired into us. I mean, sometimes we do reason about it, but in general, human beings both have a very, very strong pull to be loyal to one another, to develop what we can call loyalty groups, families, clans, tribes, nations. And in addition, there's an additional drive, which is to get to the top of the hierarchy. You get all sorts of things from getting to the top of the hierarchy. You get to be famous, you get money, but mostly people don't even know why they do it. By the time you're 12, you're doing it. You just want to be the kid that is influential, the one who's making the decisions. It makes you mad. You get insulted when you're not the kid who's making the decisions. Believe me, 9 children, I promise you, it's this way the whole way through, and it keeps going on in adulthood, and it never stops. All right, so look, what I mean to say about this is that if there are, in the paper I go deeper into this, because in addition to the social drives that I just described, there's also, once you have these groups, nations or tribes or families, there are emergent drives that those groups also pursue, things like cohesion and justice and independence. I won't go into them right now, but the point is there's a whole world of what human nature is, which is, I would say, not well framed, not well discussed, not well understood in Aristotle. And Aquinas follows in a lot of this. What's the point of this argument? The point of the argument is that I think that anything resembling self-evidence in these questions of what are the drives is something that should be set aside. I mean, I think human nature is very important. I think Aristotle and Aquinas say important things about it, but I don't think we can stop at that stage of our development. We need to keep arguing about it. I think we should look at this a little bit more like a science, where I don't think anybody has all the answers, and we need to be arguing about it and trying to figure out what actually are the natural human ends. If we have missed some of the crucial natural human ends, then our theory of natural law isn't going to be right, and we have missed some of the natural human ends, maybe a lot of them. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, the second point, let's look at the deduction. Okay, I was just talking about the natural human ends, which are supposed to be, in some sense, self-evident, and those are the first principles within law and morals according to Aquinas' system. Now let's talk about the next part, the deductions. Okay, now again, I'm not claiming that he's crazy like Descartes is, and that he thinks that he's infallible, and that anybody who thinks something different from him is just wrong. And Aquinas isn't like that. He's much more humble. He clearly understands and explicitly says in different places that there are limits to how well we can do this. Still, at the same time, there's 5 volumes. A very large part of those 5 volumes is devoted to these kinds of deductive arguments about what is the conclusion, the determination. In Jewish law, the rabbis say the psak. Psak means, okay, so there's all these principles, and we're arguing, and there's a big argument about it. But the psak, the determination, the conclusion, where does the argument stop? What do we need to do in order to get the argument to stop and to have an answer, that's an answer that can hold good for generations and across cultures and so on. So, look, I think that human reason is much less capable of doing this kind of deduction, certainly than Descartes thinks. But I even think Aquinas is a little bit too optimistic, even though he's less optimistic. In part, hold on a second. Look, in part, I think that he's too optimistic. Well, let's think about this. Let's say that we have a first principle, a natural human end, like breathing. Okay, breathing's an easy one. Everybody needs to breathe. We breathe all the time. You can stop it. You can make a rational. You can decide I'm not going to breathe. You can say I'm going to learn to swim. When I'm underwater, I'm not going to be breathing. Okay, it's worth it for me to swim. It's worth it for me to dive. You can say I'm not going to breathe when I'm in a burning building, or if there are chemical fumes, in the air because because a train collided with my city and people haven't been able to clean it up. Or the doctor tells you hold your breath, or do other funny things when you're breathing. There's all sorts of reasons why you don't always breathe. Okay, now, can you say that in general, as a general principle, breathing is a natural human end, and human beings in general should breathe? Yeah, of course you can. And there is some kind of derivation or connection there between what human beings are and what they ought to do. If somebody comes and tells me, look, in general, human beings ought to breathe, I'm not going to argue against that. It's true. It's simply true, right? So, but the question is, what's the connection between that general statement and getting down to the particular case that you have in hand? That's the problem. The problem is, how do you get from this very general thing, which is true, down to something else? And knowing that something is a natural human end does not give you an answer as to what you should do in all cases, right? Just because in general we ought to breathe doesn't mean that in all cases we ought to breathe, okay? When you're swimming, you shouldn't. And also, it doesn't tell you what you should do in a particular case, okay? Because if we're talking about how do you know that there are that there's the burning house scenario and there's the diving and swimming scenario. How do you know these things? The answer is there is nothing that reason can do, this deductive reasoning from first principles, nothing that it can do to answer these questions. It's powerless. These questions get answered only because you live in a society in which, for thousands of years people have been swimming, and your parents taught you to swim, and everybody has a tradition about what to, how to go about saying when you're not supposed to breathe. Now, when I picked breathing, I purposely picked an example where there's very, very few exceptions. Okay, the reason I picked this example is so that it's clear that even in a case where there's very few exceptions, you can't figure out what the exceptions are by reasoning. You can only by deductive reasoning. You can from the principles. You can only figure it out through examining at great length what different human beings do, different human societies do, and trying to come up with, from experience, with generalizations about what the limits of the principle are. Now, every other natural human end is much more complicated, that I can think of, is much more complicated than the case of breathing. All right, so if you think about sex, everybody's always arguing about when should you have sex? With whom should you have sex? Under what conditions? There's no end to argument about sex. Same with food. What should you eat? How should you eat? When should you eat? How much should you eat? The experts, every few weeks, some expert comes up with a new thing that you should eat this and you shouldn't eat that. The same is true for violence. When should you be violent? When should you not? What are the limits? Or property. Is property theft, like the communists say? I mean, there's endless argument about virtually everything that makes this the idea that there is a reliable deduction from the principles, I think, very, very doubtful. Let's look at a couple of examples. Both of these are, I've picked examples in which my tradition, my Orthodox Jewish tradition, is at odds. Let me emphasize that there are plenty of things that Aquinas and my tradition agree with. So I'm not trying to say, look, we disagree about everything, but I think it's helpful to be able to see the way a different tradition reasons in order to be able to understand the issue. So let's talk about the issue of celibacy. I'm sure that's what you all wanted to talk about today. Look, obviously, if Aquinas thinks that having sexual relations and having children and raising them is a natural human end, which he does, and it's one of the most important ones. It appears, hundreds of times in the Summa, and so you would think that would be a good case where he would say, well, look, that's a natural human end, so people should have children and raise them, but he doesn't. And the question is, how does he come to does he go about trying to convince us that human beings should not necessarily have children? So the first thing is two arguments. I'm going to call these bridge principles. It's like a fancy technical term from philosophy. I may not be using it correctly, but for today, let's call these bridge principles. How does he get from the principle of people ought to have children down to, but people are devoted to God, people are seeking knowledge of God, they don't have to have children? Okay, how does he do that? So his first bridge principle, his first argument is, he says, look, there are goods of the external goods, goods of the body, goods of the soul. He places them in a hierarchy, and he says, look, of these things, the goods of the soul, knowledge, learning about God, getting close to God, those are the most important things. So if you can sacrifice some external goods, property, in order to in order to get closer to God, gain knowledge, then that's reasonable. That's a reasonable thing to do. Reason and nature say that you ought to do that. He says, if you refrain from certain external and bodily goods, quote, in order more freely to give, if he refrains in order to give more freely of himself to the contemplation of truth, then that's something that's defensible. Reason can understand that, because the contemplation of truth is more important than these bodily goods. So obviously, you need to eat. You're not going to starve yourself to death for the sake of knowledge. But if there are things that you can cut out in order to make more time for knowledge, he says, that makes sense. Reason backs that up. The problem is that argument only gets us so far. It suggests that those ends which benefit the soul should, as a general matter, have priority in the lives of human individuals, to the extent that it's feasible. But it doesn't say anything about the termination of, the permanent termination of any kind of sexual activity or having children. To bridge the remaining gap, he introduces a second bridge argument. And his argument is like this. He distinguishes between duties that are fulfilled by a certain person, okay, that like eating. Nobody can eat for you. If you don't eat, you're going to die. So you have a duty, you have an obligation to eat, and there's no way you can give up on that obligation. You just have to eat. Every person has to eat. Every single person has to eat. But then there are other duties. He calls them duties that must be fulfilled by the multitude. So he says, look, if there's a nation, if your people is having children, they're having families, and they're having children, then it's being taken care of. Somebody's having children, so you don't necessarily have to have children. You don't have to have every single person having children. And if you combine these two arguments, then you can get to an argument where he says, look, definitely it's a good thing. It's a human good. If people get married, they have children. But there's a higher good that's being served by some individuals if they devote themselves to truth, to knowledge, and to God. Okay, so look, that's a sensible argument. You know, within the context of thinking in Aquinas' tradition, it makes a lot of sense. It's a sensible argument, and everybody should be proud to say that this is a reasonable and reasoned argument. But it's not the only way of looking at things. Okay, so let's start with this. If you go with Plato and Aristotle, and you say the perfect, there are eternal and unchanging things which are perfect, and those are higher and better than temporal things, than changing things. Okay, so that's an argument common to Plato and Aristotle, which Aquinas adopts for all sorts of purposes. It's a metaphysical argument that says some things are perfect and eternal and unchanging. Those things are better than the things that are transitory, fleeting, constantly changing. Okay, this is a big, famous metaphysical claim, and one of the interesting things about this claim, if you're coming at it from the Jewish tradition, is that although in the Middle Ages there are Jewish thinkers that adopt it, but this is not the way that the Hebrew Bible or the rabbis of the Talmud. This is not the way that they approach the world. The second verse of Genesis tells us that the world before its creation is tohu. Tohu means chaos. That there's motion. There's God's spirit. The word for spirit is a sort of a problematic translation. The word is ruach. Ruach means wind. It literally means wind. So we have on the one hand like the chaotic motion at the beginning of Genesis, and then we have God's wind or his breath or his spirit. Whatever it is, there's the chaotic motion and there's the motion that is impressing itself on the chaotic waters. And from this, the world is then created. God speaks over and over again, and each time that he speaks, the world gets formed and shaped. Okay, now in the tradition that I come from, the highest good is this combination of form being impressed upon the chaos which creates being, which creates the world that we live in. That's the thing that in the Bible is called very good. It's this world that's being called very good, and not a different world which isn't even, it's not named, it's not described. Later in the Bible maybe you can find hints of it. My point is that if you're coming from this perspective where the highest good is the creation of the existing world, which Plato and Aristotle see as like the lesser world, the less good thing, then you come up with statements like the very, very famous rabbinic Talmudic statement, great is the Torah because it leads to deeds. The highest good is not contemplating eternal perfect things. The highest good is helping God with the creation of the world. This is something that it's kind of like a Jewish slogan. If you hang out with Jewish people, they're always telling you, yeah, let's fix the world, let's fix the world. Sometimes it's annoying, but it is based on a very serious argument about metaphysics. Now, so let's go back to this question about sexual relations. From the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, the things that human beings are doing that God loves are active things. They're active things in the world. The prophets don't talk like Aristotle, saying, it's better to have the contemplative life than to have the active life. For the prophets, having the active life, that's the good that you can do. And then the question becomes, is having children, is that part? Aquinas says that's part of the active life, and the prophets think so too. In the first chapter of Genesis, the first commandment that God gives human beings is be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and you can keep going and finding out. I mean, I think I'll just press fast forward rather than coming up with more examples, but you get the idea. If your tradition of reason is rabbinic, then you look at God creating the world, and you say the highest thing that a human being can do is to help create the world. You look at God bringing life into the world, and you say, okay, so every human being should, just about one of the highest things you can do is to bring life into the world. And so then you're not surprised when the rabbis say, look, anybody who can have children should have children. They don't have a category for, you can devote yourself to higher, purer things, because the higher, better thing is the having children. Okay, now I really want to go into other examples, but my time is almost up. So anybody who wants to can ask me about the famous example of the madman at the door with a knife threatening to kill somebody in the house. Aquinas says that you're not allowed to lie in order to save the life of the person in the house, but I'm not going to comment on that. So to wrap up, here's the thought. I think that Aquinas is mistaken to think that it's possible through deduction from first principles to get to determinations that have any kind of reliability. Okay, because that's not the way things actually work. The way things actually work, I think, is he's certainly correct that we have all of these different principles, but the principles are undergoing are being handed down by tradition, and they're being pushed and pulled by trial and error. I think it's actually closer to scientific traditions, where people come up with a theory and then they test it out and they work to strengthen it and to improve it. Here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a theory of what leads to human flourishing, and I don't believe that it's possible to accurately describe what we're doing without seeing that we're constantly balancing between different first principles which are contesting one against another. Only through trial and error over centuries and thousands of years do we develop the precise location of the balancing point between the principles. And different traditions, different human traditions, hand down different theories about where the right places are. Okay, so there's a Catholic tradition, there's a Jewish tradition, and both are searching for the truth. And both are holding on to the truth and trying to describe, what's the human flourishing that God wants from us? How does it work best? I don't know how these things in the end get resolved. It's going to be a very long time until either the Christians move towards the Jews or the Jews move towards the Christians. This could take a very long time. But that doesn't mean that we're not seeking truth with these traditions. The tradition is the instrument that we use to seek the truth. And as we work to constantly adjust and reframe these traditions so that they are the best expression of what God wants from us, as we do that, I think that we can improve the traditions. I think we can move towards very, very to repairs and restorations of things that help us to be better. But I think that if you set aside the fact that there are huge metaphysical principles, huge bridge principles that are not explicit in the deductions that are being assumed, then you won't understand what it is that we're arguing about. So I think that, look, Aquinas is it's a massive and beautiful attempt to make sense of this great Christian tradition that he's inherited, and in his love of the pursuit of truth and the magnificence of the scope of what he's trying to do, it can teach all of us, whether we're Christian or not. But I think that the method it's not sufficient for what many of his students today think that it can do. It can't do what they think it can do. It can't give us reliable answers that all human beings can come to. It's just not going to be that easy. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Hazony. Professor Hazony has offered us an interesting and thought-provoking reading of Aquinas, couched in a still more insightful critique of how he sees natural law as kind of emerging in contemporary culture. And I have to say, if we bracket Aquinas, which I'll have more to say about in a moment, if we bracket Aquinas from the discussion, I find much of what you have to say true, insightful. I'm in agreement with you on a lot. I just think that Aquinas is too. So if I read Aquinas as Professor Hazony reads him, I would be in wholehearted agreement with his assessment. Aquinas' natural law theory is limited in deep and obvious ways. But I do not read Aquinas as Professor Hazony reads him, and or I should add, as Robbie George reads him. I think a lot fell into place for me, I think, when you mentioned that you were his student. And I'm going to use the time allotted to me to try to explain why. Now, there's a lot here. You said a lot of very, very interesting things. I can't touch on all of them. I have to choose. So I'm going to focus my remarks on the point that I think best illuminates the difference between my Aquinas and Professor Hazony's, namely the respective roles of virtue and natural law in Aquinas' moral theory. On my reading, the natural habitual knowledge of the natural law plays an important and foundational, but otherwise relatively small role in Aquinas' moral theory. Far from ascribing to a rationalist method, wherein right action consists in rationally deducing right actions from an apparently very large set of axioms, Aquinas, as I read him, thinks that natural law actually gives us very little. The cultivation, as I read Aquinas, the bulk of the moral life consists in the cultivation of virtue. Only someone who is virtuous can approximate right application of the vague and general knowledge given by the natural law. And the cultivation of even natural virtue, moreover, is not, as I read Aquinas, something that we do on our own. It requires teachers, good laws, and the very thing that Hazony thinks Aquinas does not pay enough attention to, namely Scripture. So I'm going to try and explain that a little bit. So Professor Hazony tells us several times that the natural law theory of Aquinas is a system constructed by the rationalist method. Under such a system, we are told one begins from a set of self-evident principles, and by means of deductive reasoning, moves from those self-evident principles to determinations of law and morals. More or less the same model, albeit less hubristic, more attentive to tradition, but more or less the same model later used by Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, and all of the other bad guys, right? Professor Hazony argues a rationalist theory of natural law doesn't work. self-evident principles aren't self-evident, the deductions that supposedly follow don't follow, and so on and so forth. I agree. But I also don't think that Aquinas either employs or intends to advocate a rationalist method. I think this because I think principle means something rather different for Aquinas than it does for Descartes and his followers, and because I do not think Aquinas envisions that the requirements of natural law be deduced from his principles in a deductive or mathematical way, or in any way, indeed, that would make Aquinas a rationalist, in the sense of rationalist we've been talking about here. Aquinas discusses the natural law in a few questions near the end of the Prima Secundae. But he begins referencing the principles of natural law and the role they play in the moral life much earlier. At the beginning of his account of virtue is one of the earlier places. And virtue is a topic, I might add, that occupies a great deal more of Aquinas' attention than does the natural law. In fact, in the entire second part, Aquinas devotes a grand total of 18 questions to the natural law. But he devotes 384, if the math is wrong, you have to forgive me, that was a quick count, right, to virtue. Nothing can be ordered to any end, says Aquinas, unless some proportion to the end pre-exists in it, a proportion from which there arises in it a desire for the end. And this happens insofar as a sort of beginning, the Latin is inception, right? Inceptio, of the end comes to exist in it. Since it desires nothing except to the extent that it desires some likeness of that beginning. The point is a thoroughly Aristotelian one. Man does not desire any end, let alone his ultimate end, unless he already has some kind of knowledge. Perhaps a vague and confused knowledge, right, which Aquinas actually in some places calls inchoate knowledge, a vague and confused knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless of the end that he's ordered to. This vague, confused, inchoate knowledge, Aquinas then proceeds to say, is exactly what the principles of the natural law provide. And so it is, says Aquinas, that in human nature itself there's a sort of beginning of that good which is proportionate to human nature. For in human nature, there naturally pre-exists the principles of demonstration, known per se, which are the seeds of wisdom, and certain principles of the natural law, which are the seeds of the moral virtues. Now, I can't go into it here, but it's worth flagging the point that Aquinas makes some important distinctions about what it means for something to be known per se, distinctions that I think are directly relevant to the question of just how much knowledge the natural law provides. But that's a different 10-minute commentary, so I'm not going to talk about it. At any rate, as the quote I just read makes clear, the principles of the natural law give us a vague and imperfect understanding of our end, and in so doing, enable us to desire it. The orienting knowledge given by the natural law, like the principles of demonstration, Aquinas tells us are seeds. Wisdom and virtue grow out of them. It is important, in my view, that Aquinas calls the principles of the natural law seeds. Seeds are indeed a source and an origin. Seeds do, in some sense, contain the whole that will come. But seeds are importantly not self-sufficient. Seeds do not bear fruit without the right kind of cultivation. In the middle of his Prima Secundae treatment of virtue, in the process of distinguishing the intellectual virtues from the moral virtues and vice versa, Aquinas asks whether intellectual virtues can exist without moral virtues. The answer to this question matters quite a lot. Because if Aquinas really does have a rationalist method, then it seems that prudence, right, the habit that allows us to move from principles to conclusions about how to act in a particular instance, if Aquinas really does have a rationalist method, then it seems that prudence really wouldn't need the moral virtues. It seems indeed that there really wouldn't be much of a place for moral virtue at all, at least not when it came to figuring out how one ought to act. Right? Rightly ordered appetites, to be sure, might help us be more successful in right action and actually doing the right action. They might help us act more readily or more consistently or more promptly, but they wouldn't play an essential role in reasoning itself. And this is how I take Professor Hazony to be reading Aquinas. Professor Hazony points out that Aquinas says in the 6th article of question 47 of the Secunda Secunda that the natural law gives us even the ends of the various moral virtues. Prudence applies what the natural law gives. The natural law gives us the ends of the moral virtues. There are lots of moral virtues, so the natural law gives us quite a lot. We act morally by applying the principles. Sounds like a rationalist method. I agree, it sounds like one. But if that were how Aquinas envisioned prudential reasoning, then it would seem to follow that we could successfully cultivate the natural law, successfully cultivate the virtue of prudence in applying the natural law without moral virtue, right? It's not clear what moral virtue would be needed. The principles, including their various ends and reason, would be enough, and so we could be prudent without having moral virtues. But Aquinas, of course, denies that one can reason well about action on the basis of the principles of the natural law alone. He insists that we cannot render the principles of the natural law specific in action unless we have acquired the moral virtues. To put the point differently, Aquinas seems to deny the very thing that the holder of a rationalist method would want to affirm. So I think we need to take a more in-depth look at what Aquinas says. In the text I've been referring to, which is question 58, article 5 of the Prima Secundae, Aquinas is emphatic that prudence cannot exist at all without the moral virtues. And it cannot, he tells us, because of the inadequacy of the natural law. I'm going to look at what he says next with some care, because I think it involves precisely what we are discussing here. Prudence, says Aquinas, is right reason with respect to what can be done, not only in general, but also in particular cases, which are actions. But right reason, Aquinas continues, requires principles from which reasoning proceeds. Aquinas then makes a distinction between universal principles and particular principles, and tells us that with respect to particular matters, reason needs to proceed not only from universal principles, but also particular principles. The natural law and some sort of practical knowledge, Aquinas tells us, makes us rightly ordered to the universal principles. But the universal knowledge given in natural law and whatever practical knowledge we have, Aquinas tells us, quote, is not sufficient for reasoning correctly about particular matters. Why? Because, quote, it sometimes happens that a universal principle of the sort in question is corrupted in a particular case by some passion. We cannot reason well about the universal principles given in the natural law, that is to say, unless we have rightly ordered desires. And so, Aquinas says, just as a man is disposed toward being correctly related to the natural principles through natural understanding of a habit of knowledge, so too, in order for him to be correctly related to the particular principles of what is to be done, i.e. the ends, he must be perfected by habits in accord with which it becomes in some sense connatural to him to judge correctly concerning the end. And this, he says, is affected by moral virtue. Now, Aquinas' remarks about the difference between universal and particular principles are very interesting in their own right. I have thoughts about that I'm not going to talk about here. But I think the text makes one thing abundantly clear. Whatever it is that we are given in the natural law, we do not reason well about how to apply it in practice unless and until, and in the degree to which, we cultivate the moral virtues. That, not whatever is or is not given in the natural law, is the hard part. And that is why Aquinas devotes so much space to a discussion of virtue and so little to a discussion of natural law. Of course, if Aquinas thinks that the cultivation of virtue is simply a matter of habitually applying the principles of the natural law, or if anyone can cultivate virtue simply by applying the knowledge he already has, then my objection wouldn't carry very much weight. But Aquinas, as I read him at least, thinks that the cultivation of virtue requires the very things that Professor Hazony thinks he doesn't pay enough attention to: teachers, parents, laws, and last but certainly not least, Scripture. Aquinas says we cause the virtues that order us to our natural fulfillment in ourselves through our repeated actions. But by cause in ourselves, he merely means that we, not someone else, must repeatedly see the goodness of the appropriate act and choose to do it before the requisite habit can be generated. He is abundantly clear, most clear in his discussion of these questions in the De Veritate about what teaching consists of. He is abundantly clear that in the typical case, our reasoning needs help. Sure, there are some things, the things most obviously opposed to reason, like killing innocent people, that most people can recognize are wrong. But to become a genuinely good moral reasoner about what conduces to our natural flourishing and what opposes it, we need guidance and help. We need teachers who can help our reason move along the appropriate paths, to help us see why some actions are right and some actions are wrong. And this is why teachers and laws and upbringing matter. And this is one of the reasons why the divine law is given to us by God. Someone has to help our reason along the appropriate paths repeatedly enough that we can cultivate the virtues that are going to allow us to see it for ourselves. Okay, so I've been explaining why I disagree with Professor Hazony about Aquinas. I think Aquinas would be misguided if he thought natural law were a kind of self-sufficient system capable, on the basis of dubiously self-evident principles, of deciding whatever question might come along. But Aquinas, as I read him, doesn't have that view of natural law. Having voiced my disagreement, I'd like to end by mentioning something that I think Professor Hazony and I are in complete agreement about, namely the limitations of natural law theorizing. I readily agree that there is a temptation to treat natural law in a rationalist way, to assume that certain set of self-evident principles can all by themselves generate conclusions about the very deep problems we face. And I very readily agree that that temptation ought to be avoided at all costs. As far as that critique goes, I am completely in Professor Hazony's camp. I just think that Aquinas is too.
Well, this is a very rich paper. There's just so much that could be said. 10 minutes is not much time, so I'll do what any self-respecting academic would do, which is just speak twice as fast as I should be speaking to get that much more in, right? No, that's not going to work. First, I want to start with the fact that I really do think it's wonderful to see Dr. Hazony engaging with Aquinas this way. And as I say, there's so much in the paper that's very rich. And I wish I could deal with more of that. I also want to say that I think I agree with every word Dr. Knobel said. I think she's exactly right. And basically, the bottom line is that Dr. Hazony and we are in heated agreement. This is Hadley Arkes's old phrase, that in fact we agree on so much more than Dr. Hazony thinks. His first contention is that Aquinas' account of natural human ends is unpersuasive because he thinks that the claims about self-evidence are are actually much stronger than can actually be made. And then the second problem is the insufficiency of reasoning or deducing more specific moral norms from the general principles. And again, as Dr. Knobel said, I think what we say is, yeah, we think Aquinas agrees actually, that especially in that second point. I won't deal with the first point. I actually do think Aquinas overstates exactly how clear the self-evidence of certain things is. Let me begin, though, by giving my account for how I think natural law reasoning and acting works in practice. The starting point is the first principle of practical reason. The good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. You move there to common principles, which are, for example, act according to reason. That is, because if the good is what we seek, human beings are beings for whom reasoning is a good thing, and so you need to act according to reason. Okay? So that, I think, is plausibly something that human beings virtually universally recognize, although they may have incorrect perceptions of what the good is or of what constitutes reason. Get more troubles when you get down to what would be called the primary precepts of natural law in Aquinas, because Aquinas tends to equate these with the principles of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And I think Aquinas may do that under pressure to have a high level of respect for the Word of God. And so he's in some ways harmonizing what the Ten Commandments say with what his kind of outline of natural law is. And I think that leads him to go too far in saying that the principles of the Decalogue are actually self-evident to all. I think Dr. Hazony is right that Aquinas overstates that principle. But there you go from so you have the first principle of practical reason, common principles like act according to reason, primary precepts like those of the Decalogue. So that involve things like worshiping God, honoring your parents, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. And I agree that those are not quite as self-evident as we'd like them to be to everybody. And so I think the primary precepts actually blend into the secondary precepts, where Aquinas says, well, in fact, it's self-evident, but it's not self-evident to everybody. It's self-evident to the wise. Self-evidence is, if you understand the terms, the subject and the predicate, if you understand those two terms, then just by seeing that, you see that the statement is correct. Classic example, the principle of non-contradiction in speculative reason. Thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect. There's no way to prove that, actually. You read it, you understand the parts, and if you understand the parts, you see that it's true. So, but then you can move down to more detailed precepts from those. But the more detailed precepts are not as clear, because people tend not to understand the terms of the proposition as well. So only the wise are likely to understand those. You get this kind of gradation, in terms of what people are able to know. The question is, if that's true, and I think Dr. Hazony's right about this, that you move pretty quickly to things that are not self-evident to all, does that make the self-evident principles useless or worthless? And the answer is, I don't think so. I think they actually still provide a very important role in providing principles from which we reason in order to figure out what are we going to do. And that brings us to the second point. And that second point had to do with whether it's a process of logical deduction that is what Aquinas is describing. And as Dr. Knobel argued, I emphatically would deny that Aquinas thinks that that living a moral life is a process of logical deduction from the self-evident truths, working down to this particular concrete act. I would call it, and I think the term is often used as derivation. You derive more specific principles from higher ones, but it's certainly not logical deduction. You might have to, talking really more about perception, that if you understand this principle, I think what happens is, I'd use a somewhat different image from the one Dr. Hazony describes. I think you have a kind of dialectic between the principles of natural law, the precepts of natural law, primary and secondary, and what you might call the factual realities that we're engaging with. If you're a doctor trying to heal people, or take some examples that Dr. Hazony mentions, if somebody shows up the door with, the knife, what do you say to him? And you have to understand the detailed circumstances, and there's a kind of dialectic between these natural law precepts and a knowledge of the particulars in the area of human activity that we're talking about. And that dialectic is all guided, and this is the important point that Dr. Knobel makes, all guided not just by logical processes, it's guided especially by a right orientation of the will, by virtue. This is what enables us to see things, perceive things clearly. So, for example, let me take another example, theft. Theft is one of the primary precepts. It's one of the precepts of the Decalogue, and that's something that should be known by all, Aquinas says. Now, what about this much more highly detailed example of an issue that looks like theft? You got a poor man who can't support his family for no reason, no fault of his own, and he takes something from the superfluous wealth of a rich man, maybe his chickens, or whatever, in order to support his family. Has he stolen? And Aquinas would say, no, what he's done is actually moral. That it's legitimate for him to do that. Where does he get that from? It has to do with, you have to have an understanding of what's the background issue here, property. What's the nature of property? And the fact of the matter is, why property rights are important, Aquinas would say, they're not absolute. All the property, the resources of the world are intended by God to be able to provide for the well-being, the material well-being, the support of all the people in the world, which is why, while property rights are important, they're not absolute. Because if you have superfluous wealth that's not really necessary, and others don't have it, then it's legitimate for some kind of redistribution, including the poor man sneaking into the guy's chicken pen, whatever it is, and taking a chicken to feed his family. That's not stealing, although you kind of would describe it initially as that, right? But it's not, Aquinas would argue. I think the same thing is true with the example of the madman with the knife. And here I have to admit, I think I definitely disagree with Aquinas, and I'm probably outside the mainstream of the Christian intellectual tradition. I think, I'm with G.K. Chesterton on this. If the Nazi shows up at the front door looking for Jews, you invent the biggest, most persuasive lie that you can in order to make sure that Nazi doesn't find the Jews. Except technically, I wouldn't call it a lie. I'd make the distinction between lying and deliberate, misleading. The same thing I'd make in the distinction between the stealing and the taking, right? That if you understand the nature of the activity at issue, that's where I think you'd come out. So, bottom line is, as I said, I think we're in agreement on so much in terms of the impossibility of simply logically deriving concrete moral judgments from the precepts of the natural law. And this is where I think the focus on virtue that Dr. Knobel emphasized is so key. Let's see. 6 seconds left. Well, I guess that's pretty. I guess that's pretty simple, isn't it? So we can talk about other things. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you for this gracious, generous, gentle, supportive criticism. I really appreciate it. It's nice to have a good discussion with people who are kind. Look, I don't think that I can fully agree with the characterization of the Summa as having 18 questions on natural law and then many hundreds on I don't think that's what happens in the Summa if you actually read it. Here's one thing that I feel quite confident about is that that it's true that there are certain parts that are that deal with theology, that are that are making arguments based on scripture, but a very, very large proportion of the Summa, and I'm just throwing a dart, maybe 2/3 of it is dealing with things that that constantly refer back to nature and reason. The natural law is not it's not confined to 18 chapters. It appears over and over and over again throughout the work, and I don't think that I understand everything that Aquinas is doing well enough to be able to understand the proper balance between virtue and prudence, which is one huge theme, and nature and reason and law, which is another huge theme, which is constantly there. But let me push back just a little bit. There are hundreds of questions in the Summa that are, in fact, constructed according to, what we're calling the rationalist method. They're not all based on judgment and prudence and virtue and you should just figure it out based on being the right kind of person as you approach it. Let's talk about this madman with a knife for a moment. There's hundreds of examples like this, but I love this one because it makes people so angry. First of all, Aquinas thinks that loving your neighbor is a first principle of the law, and he's emphatic and in many different places in the Summa that in deriving from loving your neighbor conclusions like you should help your neighbor. If your neighbor is missing something, you need to help them. If your neighbor is in danger, then you should help them. If somebody is under attack, he says, commenting on Ambrose's interpretation of Moses goes out to see the enslaved Hebrews, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he kills him. And Ambrose says, "Look, it's justified if he thinks that the slave was going to be killed." Then Ambrose says, "If you don't interfere in order to defend the person who's being attacked, then it's just like you're killing him yourself." It's a very, very powerful statement, and Aquinas seems to endorse it. It's not 100%, but it seems like Aquinas is saying Ambrose is just right about this. And yet, when it comes to lying, Aquinas is very, very close to being an absolutist. He's not balancing principles, and that's why when the madman comes to the door and asks, is such and such in the house? I've come to kill him. Then you're not allowed to lie to him. And by the way, just to clarify, a parallel case in which Aquinas is sort of on the other side, the madman comes to reclaim his sword that he's left on deposit. you're not allowed, Aquinas gives a determination. He says you're not allowed to give the sword to the madman. If you see that he's going to kill people, or that he's going to use it in order to harm your country, right? There's all sorts of interesting nationalism in Aquinas that is not often referred to. If he's going to use it to harm your country, you're not allowed to give him the sword. Now, he's not saying, exercise your judgment. He's saying you're not allowed to do it. That's a psak. That's a determination. The law is you're not allowed to do it. But lying is a very, very different thing for Aquinas. Now, how does he explain this? He says, first of all, he says there's such a principle as making one's deeds good. And he says that to make one's deeds good includes necessarily ordering your deed towards the end, towards a natural end, whereas a sinful deed is one that's disordered with respect to an end. So you can immediately see all sorts of implications for, like, let's say, sexual ethics, that if your act is disordered, then it's not permissible. Or in wartime, your act has to be ordered to the proper end. If you have the wrong motives, if you have the wrong methods, it's disordered, and therefore it's not permissible. So he says with respect to lying, though, he invokes this. So lying to the madman at the door, two bridge principles, two arguments. First, he argues that a disordered or sinful deed must not be used to protect others who are in distress or danger. All right, and he's unequivocal about this. He says it's not allowed to make use of anything disordered in order to ward off injury or defects from another. All right, he's not leaving this up to prudence. He's saying this is the law. An example is that it's not lawful to steal in order to give alms. Somebody's hungry, you're not allowed to steal, because the stealing is a disordered act with respect to property, with respect to how you're supposed to treat your neighbors, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. So that's the first thing, is he says you're not allowed to do a disordered act in order to do a good deed. Second, Aquinas says a lie is disordered speech. Okay, this is a very, very big, important, interesting theoretical claim. He says, because it's contrary to the natural end of human speech. He writes, as words are naturally signs of intellectual acts, it's unnatural and undue for anyone by words to signify something that's not in his mind. Okay, it's a very, very powerful, important argument. He's saying we need to align our words with the way that we understand the world. To not do that is disordered. And for that reason, he says, it's not lawful to tell a lie in order to deliver another from any danger whatsoever. Again, very, very powerful. For example, lying in order to avoid danger or defeat in a just war, he says, quote, is always unlawful. There's very, very, very little being left here to prudence. He's saying when you go to war, it's a just war, you're doing it for the right intentions, you're doing it for the right goals, but you're not allowed to lie in order to win it. Okay, so look, I want to obviously, leave time for discussion, but I would say as follows. There are hundreds of cases in which Aquinas is introducing strong principles, stating them very powerfully, and not arguing, look, you need to use your judgment, you need to use your prudence, you need to operate under good habits. How these two parts of Aquinas fit together, I don't know enough to answer. Thank you. Oh, I'm going back up there? Okay, all right.
We're already a little bit past 6:30. I know if you need to leave, I understand. And also know some people want to ask questions. We have time for 2 questions. I'd like to start with you, these two, please. So go ahead.
Oh, hey, thank you, Dr. Hazony, for the very intriguing lecture. Very, very nice points that you made. Thank you for the responses as well. I just wanted to bring up your point about societies that are formed. So you mentioned that societies are formed by humans and animals alike. as a matter of instinct rather than exerted reason. So my question to you is, do you not think that perhaps Aquinas would grant this, and that the very existence of this instinct proves his point that it is self-evident? And perhaps that, what do you think that this would indicate about these self-evident principles, that perhaps they're not just derived from human reason, or, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that he's explicit in a number of different places in saying that marriage between a man and a woman is by reason. Okay, and he explains the reasoning. He says, besides the goal of having children, which is one natural end, there's an additional goal which he calls the society of man and woman, which is he says men and women have different things that they're good at. In order to have each helping the other get the things that are necessary in order to lead a decent life, you have to have them cooperating. There's a division of labor argument. And he makes a similar argument with respect to the formation of society. And it's interesting that Aristotle is actually Aristotle is closer to allowing that maybe it's an instinct than Plato is. In Plato, you've got a very, very clear, people are doing this because they see the benefit of a division of labor, and they're reasoning about it, and they come together. So it's interesting that Aquinas, although he's usually talking about Aristotle, but his argument, when you read it, is very, very similar to Plato's. He's saying that that people think about the benefits, and having weighed the benefits, they decide to come together. Now, your question is really good. You're saying, well, look, if that's the way the world is, then reasoning in that way is, it's universal. Everybody's going to come to the same conclusions, which I think is a completely fair interpretation. Aquinas might say exactly what you're saying. I think my problem is a little bit more forceful. I don't believe that human beings live in society because they reasoned about anything. I mean, sometimes people reason, but the main thing that's happening is that if I leave my wife and I'm in a hotel room in some random place, I feel pain. Okay, I'm just making this up. Of course, it's not a real example, but it hurts. Like the loneliness hurts. I don't want to make. Men are supposed to be masculine and stoic, so I don't want to make too much of this. Of course, it doesn't hurt too much. It's a little tiny hurt. But I can't help noticing that if my wife comes with me, then I feel happy and good, and if she stays home, then I'm kind of pathetic, and that's true for human beings in general. Is that you feel good when you're with people, you feel bad when you are away, you feel lonely, you miss home. Those pains are not things that we sit and we say, wow, is it to my benefit to be alone in this hotel room? No, it's not to my benefit. Well, that's upsetting to me. It's against reason. I should not do this. It's just something else.
And Dr. Malloy, my last question. Sorry, I'll prefer 4-hour events, but then you guys get mad at me for 4-hour events.
A wonderful presentation, and thank you for the time. If you don't mind, both of our traditions pray the Psalms, and the reason for the question is the practical. For Aquinas, theology is contemplative, but you had pointed to the practical. So I guess when our tradition reads "Your face I see," we read it one way, and so I hope this is still in the spirit of it.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
I'm just wondering, is that
Right, great question. Look, I'll give a simple answer and then make it a little bit more complicated. The simple answer is that I'm not familiar with, if you're talking about Hebrew scripture and the rabbinic tradition up until, for 1,000 years before it starts introducing Plato and Aristotle. Okay, so there's the Jewish Bible, and then there's 1,000 years of rabbinic commentary, and then after that, there's enough time to then introduce Plato and Aristotle, and then have all sorts of interesting things happen in the medieval period. So I'm talking about the Bible and the Talmud and the Talmudic literature. I'm not familiar with anything that reads the way that Aquinas reads when he's describing the afterlife. He's talking about an act of seeing God, okay? And he says this repeatedly in many different places in the Summa, that the reward that you get in the afterlife is to be able to gaze upon God, and he describes it explicitly as an eternal act of understanding. Okay, it's very, very Aristotle, and that doesn't mean that it's not beautiful, and maybe it's true, but that kind of thing doesn't turn Jews on. It just doesn't. The most important framework for Jews, both biblical and rabbinic, is the covenant. The covenant is it's a relationship in which it's a metaphor that's drawn from politics. The covenant is a relationship between a king and